Since 2019 at the Land Portal, we've been using data stories as a way to demonstrate how combining data with engaging and persuasive narratives can empower communities to tell their stories to the world. In this workshop this morning, we plan to feature a selection of recent data stories published by the Land Portal, including from the winners of our 2021 Data Stories contest, as well as perspectives from one of our Land Portal researchers. Our panelists who are here with us today will present their data stories and share their points of view with regards to writing and sharing their effective data stories. We hope that by being with us today, you can gain a better understanding of how to potentially create your own compelling stories by combining data, visual, and graphics. So for this morning's workshop, we have three main aims. We would like to present why we think data stories are key for the land sector and introduce you to the data section on the Land Portal. We'd like to introduce you to the winners of last year's Data Stories contest who are here with us today. And we would like to provide you with as much information as possible on how to publish your own data story, maybe even with us. My name is Stacey Zamet, and I'm a communications officer at the Land Portal, along with my colleague Conrad Hentz, who is the data management and visualization specialist on our team. We will be guiding you through today's discussion. Just a brief note before we begin our conversation today that interpretation is available for all of you. You can access it using the globe at the bottom of your screen. And we also have a Q&A feature for you to be able to ask either myself or Conrad questions or each of our winners who I will introduce to you in a bit. Just a brief note that this is also being recorded this morning. So Conrad, can you tell us a little bit about data stories and why they're key for the land sector?
Yes, thanks a lot, Stacey, for introducing us, or me, at this point only. Yeah, I think we are actually delighted to later on introduce the winners of our data story contest, but we thought that maybe it would be nice to frame a common understanding of what data stories are. And to understand what data stories are, maybe first we should conceptualize what data means for the land sector. And I personally think that data in terms of land and land tenure, land ownership, and this parent land ownership is that it's key. It's key to understand these questions, but also it's key to frame certain narratives and to make other people aware and understand what's happening in terms of land, land tenure, and the access to land. Despite data being so important, there is, I would say, a lack of data. Data on land is quite sparse. So the other problem of it being not so accessible or available is that it is also maybe difficult to kind of use data to communicate or to make a point or to advocate for the equal access to land, for secure tenure, and other messages to get across. And I think that's where we talk about it later. That's where data stories are actually key, and that's why we have this little workshop or discussion round. So in terms of data, I think it's important to differentiate between three different types of data, more or less. It's qualitative data, which we know as interviews, as recordings, as personal communications, maybe also videos or pictures. Quantitative data, statistics, etc. And then also spatial data, which could be in its nature also be considered as quantitative data, but we here at the Land Portal differentiate that. So we have these three different data types. And we at the Land Portal host these, and we will have a look at that later. And now, statistical data or qualitative data or spatial data. The question is, how do we work with this data to communicate it to recipients, to possible donors, to activists, to other interest groups, to the media? If you look at big NGOs like Amnesty or global big media outlets, we realize that it becomes more and more important to digest this data. We don't just communicate numbers. Yeah, we form graphs, we simplify it, we produce visuals, and maybe in the internet even do this interactively. You wouldn't find any newspaper source or internet page, web page, where data is just presented. They always have certain graphs. You can click things. You would have pop-ups. You can change between different years, etc. So if you think about COVID and the COVID numbers, how those all over the globe have been produced, I think that's a perfect example how the communication of data has changed. And we in the land sector, I think, or we from the Land Portal think, have to keep up with that change and communicate data more effectively. So yeah, you could say it's more attractive to communicate this data, but data stories or the way we communicate data also helps us, to contextualize it or to frame it. So we can transport a certain narrative to our reader, to our viewer, to our partner who's engaged with us. So instead of giving a bunch of data, numbers, statistical figures, or maybe cadastral data to a person, it would be much nicer if we would have a perfectly digested overview. And on top of that overview, we already communicate the narrative which we would like to, or the point we would like to make. Yeah, I think that's in a rough sense on what data on land is and what it means to communicate it to others.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Conrad, for giving us an overview of that and the importance that data can have in communicating about land issues. Maybe this is a good time to ask the audience, each of you, a little bit more information from our audience about, where they stand with regards to their use of data within their organizations. So I will just launch a brief poll. And so I've just launched it. If our attendees, guests, if you would like to just answer the question, I see that most of you, almost 100%, I think, do work with data within your organization, and that's great to know. And that's probably why you've joined us here today. So we're glad to see that. I'll give you a few more seconds to answer the question, but it looks like 97% of those of you joining us do actually use data. So that's great. Okay, so that's good information for us to know. Let me just launch our second poll. I hope I'm doing this correctly. So poll number 2, there you go. So what kind of data are you working with? So now that we know that so many of you are indeed working with data, it's nice for us to know, what type of data that you're using, some of the ones that Conrad mentioned. So we'll give you a little bit of time to answer. It looks pretty, well, actually qualitative data looks like the type of data that most people are using, but in terms of visual, quantitative, and spatial, it looks pretty equal. I'll just give everyone a few moments to keep answering. Okay. Yes, so it looks like about 77% of you are using qualitative data. And then, it's pretty even across the board in terms of visual and quantitative and spatial data. So that's also good information for us to know. And thank you to everyone for answering that. If you have any more specific experience with data and data stories that you would like to share, feel free to do so in the chat. And also feel free, if you would like, to introduce yourselves on the chat and maybe tell us a little bit more about your specific experiences with data, or if you have experiences with data stories, we'd love to read those via the chat, and it'll also be nice for other attendees to be able to read that while we're chatting and discussing.
Yeah,
So
I
Conrad,
think it's
yeah.
sorry. Yeah, I think it's quite nice. Sorry for interrupting you to follow the chat as well. If you open the chat box and also engage there a bit, and maybe there are some other attendees who could answer your questions or share your pain or experience or whatever to what it comes to working with data. And meanwhile, I can just take the opportunity and share my screen. If that works, hopefully, and show you the webpage I hope everyone in this virtual room or space knows and recognizes, the land portal page. And here we do have our data section, which we are quite proud of. And here we feature different data sets, and you can again see the kind of data sets we differentiate. So we do feature statistical data, and we feature more recently, I would say, not that extensively yet, spatial data. And statistical data are, in this case, mainly indices, country rankings, numbers of tenure security, or performance indexes. How is tenure security perceived in certain countries, etc. And this data is actually assorted or grouped by the organization featuring this data set. So I would click on statistical data, and you would see the different data sets we feature, but also you can actually search these by different keywords. So if I would look for customary tenure, for instance, I can just search for tenure, click on customary tenure, filter our data sets, and then would get the indicators, and also, and that's the point, visualized a bit. So here we have country rankings. We see the first 5 countries and the lowest performing countries. And if we look at other data sets, statistical ones, we would have kind of maps where you could look for indicators and then see performance indexes on this map. So we do have already in the data section a little bit of representation of figures, which makes it way more digestible than just producing a table. On the contrary, if we talk about our spatial data, here we would have real, I guess you might know the landmark or landmark map, which is quite popular. We would actually have actual data like tenure ownership, conservancies, communal areas, spatially represented on a map. So it's different than having a country ranked by an indicator. Yeah, I think I don't have to go into much more detail, because I mean, if most of the attendees here work with data, probably I'm just boring people anyway. But I can just invite you to maybe have a look at our data section, because I think there are quite interesting data sets you could work with. However, we realized at the land portal exactly what the point I made in the beginning. We should kind of find ways how we can communicate data more effectively than just hiding it in the data section. And also, I mean, we all working with land, we know it's not only about statistical figures, country rankings or whatever, it's about people living on the land, people owning the land or not owning it, the struggle for resources, for equality and representation. And this, together with the audience's desire to get maybe digested data, we came up with story maps at the land portal. And if you look at the data section in the second lowest of these links, we do have a section on data stories. And we feature a variety of data stories from all over the globe about carbon sequestration in communal areas, the change of land use and agriculture production with the global maize boom in Thailand. We have stories about pastoralists in Iran. A lot of on communal areas in South Africa, and the differences between former communal areas and freehold lands. We have them in different languages. And also, I think it's a beautiful example on how we can frame a narrative and communicate it, but also how we can mix different data together. So we work with visuals, we work with statistical data, we work with spatial data, we work with qualitative data. So we can mix videos and interviews and pictures and show a map where people live or the resources they fight for, or where people are expropriated, and then tell their story. Then I think that's the compelling thing about story maps. So in the past, we were just featuring data, and now we at the Land Portal moved on to these more interactive ways of present narratives and also people's perspectives. Yeah, it's also a way more inclusive way to represent data and land, just than producing figures. So we can communicate these narratives. And to populate our data section with these data stories, in the past, we ran certain data contests per year. And I think with this, I can just hand over to you, Stacey.
Yeah, thanks, Conrad. As you were talking, I was thinking also about the fact that, you were saying that data stories are a good way to sort of package the data. And from the flip side of that, I think as someone working in communications, oftentimes we use the written word and just simple blogs with a picture to talk about things. And I think on the flip side of that, the data stories allow us to still have the narrative and the written word, but use all the different means that you talked about to really illustrate the point more dynamically in a way. So I won't say too much. I'll just segue off of what you said, Conrad, and begin by introducing our data story contest winners. Before I do that, I just wanted to let everybody know that the chat is now open in case you would like to discuss further there, or as I said, introduce yourselves or ask us any questions. If you have questions, please do use the Q&A box, and we will get to them later. So as Conrad mentioned, we've had a few data story contests, and today we have the 3 winners with us of the 2021 Data Stories contest. We have the first winner, who is Diana Wachira, and her story is called Rapid Mapping of Areas Marked for Demolitions, and she will tell us a little bit about her story. We have the second prize winner, which is by Dr. Manuel Enrique Perez Martinez from Colombia, and he will tell us a little bit more about his story. And we also have the third prize winner with us, Auta Acevedo, and she's coming to us from Brazil, and she will tell us a little bit more about her work as well. So maybe I can start with you, Diana, briefly. Maybe I'll let you, if it's okay with you, to introduce yourself as well as the story mentioned.
Thank you, Stacey, and I hope everyone can hear me loud and clear. My name is Diana Wachira, and I am from Nairobi, Kenya. As Stacey has mentioned, I submitted a data story that was titled Rapid Mapping of Areas Marked for Eviction. And it was really an initiative that sought to bring about spatial technology as well as land advocacy. And I'll begin by just sharing a bit, and I'll start by saying or by explaining why it's called rapid mapping. And it's because it was a very urgent reaction to a land reposition plan that would have rendered about 6 informal settlements demolished. And more than that, it was that this land reposition plan came about at a time where Kenya had just gotten its first lockdown order. The government had just issued the curfew. We had our lockdown order. It was just the first time the country was experiencing COVID-19 pandemic. So at that moment was when we had our first eviction of an informal settlement in Nairobi. And this eviction resulted in about 80,000 people being left homeless. And worse than that was that that eviction was the start to a further eviction plan of 6 other areas, because the idea of the government was that they wanted to repossess the land that was demarcated for infrastructural services, which over time had been occupied by quite big informal settlements. So once the plan for repossession was announced, it was really quite a very sad moment, because everyone was thinking, how do we get to all these informal settlements? How do we start, coming together and trying to say, then you can't evict this many people, you can't evict this settlements at this very critical time. So what we did is that we partnered with Cadastre Foundation, and using their S3 powered platforms, we were able to do this rapid mapping process. And we were able to, using local knowledge as well, we were able to identify the 6 areas, the 6 informal settlements that were targeted. Through this identification and through aerial imagery, we were able to sort of create buffers, trying to see, in case this settlement is demolished, what will be the impacts? And using this kind of visualization techniques, it was very powerful or very impactful, the kind of conversation it evoked, because people could see that, for example, in informal settlement A, if we do a buffer of 500 meters, if 500 meters around the settlement is affected, then these are the numbers of people that would end up being homeless. If 1,000 meters, so it was a really kind of visually engaging process, if I may say so. And it helped us develop a very effective land advocacy strategy, because with this kind of information, with this kind of, if people can actually see through the maps and through the photography and just see, then this is what it would mean if this settlement is evicted, then it would mean that there will be such gross violation of human rights, it will be such gross violation of property, children will be left homeless. And remember, it was a time of COVID, the COVID pandemic. So it was a time also, we were not very sure how to handle this pandemic, how to go about it. So it was a very vulnerable time. And using this data story and our visualization process that brought about spatial technology and qualitative and quantitative data, we were able to actually have a very effective land advocacy plan. And through this information, we were able to engage key stakeholders in the civil society. We were also able to engage actual community members who were able to see, when you say that, oh, a settlement will be evicted and thousands of people will lose their homes, it does not really register in your mind. But when you actually see that in this aerial imagery, these are the number of households, these are the number of structures that will be affected, then it begins to create some sort of urgency. And that's what the data story did in our case. So we were able to come together as civil society, we were able to come together as communities, and through that we were able to start start conversing with the government agencies. And it was this kind of process, or this kind of initiative was very impactful, to the point where the follow-up repossession plan was halted at that time. So we only had the first informal settlement, that was Kariobangi, that was affected before we came in. So then through this advocacy strategy, then we had the eviction repossession plan halted at that point. And of course, because I also don't want to say so much at this point, but really just to emphasize the kind of potential, the kind of implication, the kind of reach the data stories has, particularly when it comes to land advocacy. It was really good. It was really powerful seeing this kind of processes come in and also change our approaches, because it also meant that our approaches changed in a way. We were able to really embrace how to bring on board these kinds of data in advocacy processes. So I think, Stacey, I can leave it at that, and then I'll engage later on.
It's perfect. Thank you for giving us that recap. And I've also shared your story in the chat for attendees to take a look at if they would like. Just for Diana, Manuel, and Auta, some of the interpreters are asking us to slow down a little bit. I speak very quickly, so I'm going to try to slow down just to keep their jobs a little bit as easy as possible and as smooth as possible. So thanks, Diana, for sharing. And Auta, I will ask you the same question if you would like to introduce yourself, Auta, and a little bit more about your story and your work. We'd like to hear that.
Ok, bom dia a todas e todos. Primeiro eu queria agradecer o convite a mim e ao Revelar-se, que é o coletivo de mulheres que eu integro e que é responsável pela construção da história. Então, eu sou educadora popular, faço parte desse coletivo de mulheres, que é composto por mulheres moradoras de uma comunidade chamada Odk, que fica em Recife, que é a capital da cidade do estado de Pernambuco, fica no nordeste do Brasil. É daqui que eu estou falando, de Recife, dessa comunidade, que é extremamente marcada por que associa o nosso bairro, o nosso território à violência. O Odk é um bairro que fica muito próximo do centro da cidade e, por conta disso, sofre uma especulação imobiliária por ser muito próximo do centro, por ser uma área extremamente cobiçada por setores da sociedade que detêm poder econômico e político. Então, o nosso coletivo, que é um coletivo de mulheres, mulheres negras, mulheres moradoras desse território, tem realizado ações na perspectiva de construir as nossas próprias referências sobre esse território, que é visto dessa forma pela cidade, de uma forma geral. Então, o nosso trabalho, enquanto mulheres moradoras desse território, tem sido construir ações, realizar atividades que contem a nossa própria história sobre esse bairro e sobre a nossa própria vida. A nossa vida, ela está extremamente ligada a esse território. Então, nós somos um coletivo de fotógrafas que nessa perspectiva de contar a nossa própria história, contar a nossa própria versão da história e da realidade dos territórios periféricos no Brasil, trabalha com alguns instrumentos. Então, a gente trabalha com fotografia, a gente trabalha com colagem, a gente trabalha com produção de texto e também com dados nessa produção de textos. Então, a gente tem feito um esforço já desde 2006 de produzir elementos, ideias e posicionamentos sobre a realidade desse bairro. E aí é um trabalho que representa uma forma de criação e de experimentação em torno de algumas questões específicas, como raça, sexualidade, classe, território, essa relação com a cidade, as questões do direito à moradia e do direito à cidade. E aí é um trabalho que está completamente permeado pelas nossas vidas, pelas nossas emoções, pelas nossas sensações, pelos nossos aprendizados, o que é que a gente tem aprendido e construído da vida nessa relação com esse território, E aí todo o nosso trabalho está permeado por essas questões, por esses sentimentos, pelas revoltas, pelas dores, pelas paixões, pelos prazeres que também significam habitar esse território. E aí a gente utiliza para isso a fotografia, a colagem, os textos, né, e os dados como essas ferramentas de criação, e a gente tenta converter essas ferramentas em instrumentos políticos, né, mesmo de construção de uma arte, de uma forma de viver, de uma forma de falar sobre a realidade a partir de uma perspectiva feminista, negra e também periférica, né? E aí a nossa história, a história que a gente escreveu, ela está completamente permeada, né, por essas questões, né, pelas nossas emoções, pelas nossas lutas, pelas dificuldades e pelos aprendizados que a gente tem na relação com esse território, né, que é o lugar que a gente mora, e também com o resto da cidade. Então, a nossa história, então a gente tentou trazer dados da realidade, trazer dados estatísticos e dar cor, dar sentimento, dar vida a esses dados. Então, esse tem sido o nosso desafio e foi isso que a gente tentou fazer com essa história, né? Falar da nossa resistência para permanecer nesse território, né? Que é um território que vem sendo alvo, né? Dessa tentativa, né, de nos retirar desse lugar que a gente ocupa e que a gente habita há tantos anos, dessa relação de pertencimento que a gente tem, né, com esse lugar, com esse território, e o que é que isso traz para as nossas vidas, os desafios, né, e os aprendizados. Então, a história ela está toda permeada por isso, né, a gente tentou, o desafio, né, que a gente se colocou foi tentar dar vida a esses dados, e aí utilizando mapas, né, sobre a própria comunidade, a relação da comunidade com o resto da cidade, para que as pessoas que conhecem a história pudessem entender, mesmo estando distantes, né, pudessem entender que lugar é esse, o que é que ele significa para a gente, qual a relação que a gente constrói com ele e com o restante da cidade, né? Então, é uma história que foi construída coletivamente e que nos ajudou também a nos manter juntas durante um período tão difícil que foi o período da pandemia, né, aqui no Brasil, mais vulnerável, né, do país. E aí escrever essa história fez com que a gente pudesse, né, continuar juntas, mesmo com as dificuldades que a gente enfrentava devido à pandemia, né, devido à ausência de políticas específicas para dar conta das demandas e necessidades da população. Então, foi um desafio, né, não só de permanecer juntas, de dar cor, né, de dar vida a esses números, mas também de denunciar, né, a situação que a gente vive, né, que vivia de forma mais aprofundada na época, né, aqui no Brasil e no nosso território de uma maneira mais específica, né? Então, esse foi o nosso desafio, acho que inicialmente é isso que a gente poderia dizer, e aí a gente está aberta para conversar um pouco sobre essa história e que outros desafios a gente vivenciou nessa produção.
Thank
Por
you so
enquanto
much,
é
Odk,
isso.
for that. I actually have a follow-up question for yourself and Diana, because I know you've both used photography very much in your story. So I'll leave that question to the side for now, because first I'll go and ask Manuel the same question that I've asked each of you. Manuel, if you can just introduce yourself briefly as well, and just tell us a little bit about your stories as the other colleagues have done. Thank you.
Ok, gracias Stacy, Coran, Diana, Cauta, saludarlos a todos. Mi historia hace parte de mi trabajo como profesor de la Universidad Javeriana en la ciudad de Bogotá. Soy profesor de la Facultad de Estudios Ambientales y Rurales. Allí nos dedicamos a hacer investigación del tipo interdisciplinario. Y en razón a haber terminado en el año 2019 mis estudios doctorales en estudios territoriales en la Universidad de Caldas, también aquí en Colombia, el tema que traté en esta investigación pues es un acumulado de más de 15 años de trabajo pensando el papel, la importancia que tienen las periferias urbano-rurales en las ciudades contemporáneas. aquellos sitios donde termina el campo y empieza la ciudad, aquellas franjas donde hay comunidades híbridas, campesinas, que hacen producción agrícola en pequeña escala, que trabajan alrededor de la conservación de sus recursos hídricos, de sus suelos, sus bosques, pero se ven enfrentadas a el avance de la expansión inmobiliaria, del desarrollo urbano de la ciudad. Me ubiqué allí en un trabajo de más de 15 años, como les comentaba, trabajando con campesinos, líderes, gestores de la comunidad, que han venido desarrollando un esfuerzo por vincular estas periferias urbano-rurales al ordenamiento territorial de la ciudad de Bogotá, de la capital de Colombia, en un lugar donde hay alta marginalización, barrios populares, pero que limitan con áreas agrícolas. Es un tema bastante invisibilizado en las políticas públicas generales a nivel global de las ciudades, y Bogotá particularmente, su territorio es aproximadamente el 75% un área rural y solo el 25% un área urbana. Eso ya muestra una compleja relación de la importancia que tienen los territorios hoy, en la actualidad, para el desarrollo, la sostenibilidad, la adaptación al cambio climático. Estas han sido unas zonas muy afectadas por la minería de cielo abierto, de materiales de construcción y de proyectos inmobiliarios. Mi investigación de tipo académica a nivel doctoral pues está publicada en algunos libros, en algunos artículos, pero cuando me encuentro con el portal, mi reflexión es cómo traducir ese conocimiento académico que fue aportado por las comunidades a un diálogo, a una narrativa mucho más cercana a planificadores, a otros casos de pobladores rurales urbanos en otras partes del mundo. Y encuentro que esta plataforma facilita gráficamente contar esa historia de una manera más directa, más incidente, y solo lo encontré en el momento de la pandemia, cuando buscando por internet, dando vueltas por las redes sociales, me encuentro con el portal, comienzo a leerlo, a entenderlo, y me arriesgo a hacer esa traducción, vinculando material fotográfico, cartografía social elaborada con las comunidades, quitándole algunos elementos conceptuales e incluyendo material audiovisual de salidas de campo, salidas pedagógicas que yo realizo con mis estudiantes en un curso que tengo que se llama Ordenamiento Territorial, donde tratamos todos estos temas de la globalización, la tierra, el avance del desarrollo inmobiliario en zonas periféricas. Este es el resultado. Para mí ha sido fabuloso encontrar este escenario. Ya incluí dentro de mis próximos programas de docencia que nuestros estudiantes puedan traducir sus ensayos, sus reflexiones a través de las plataformas de LAM Portal y el uso pues de las historias digitales que todas las plataformas, los software están ofreciendo hoy por hoy en distintas escalas, con distintas técnicas, pero creo yo que es una manera realmente en diálogo global que le da importancia a los datos locales. Gracias por este recibimiento en esta plataforma y seguir trabajando más adelante con más aportes y más información global desde este lado del planeta, Bogotá y el país de Colombia.
Thank you so much, Manuel, for sharing. I'll just ask you a follow-up question right away, if that's okay. Can you tell us a bit more about where you got your data and information from and how you decided to frame your story? If you can give us a little more detail, even just briefly about that, that would be great.
Ok, este trabajo se encuentra relacionado con algo que viene ocurriendo en la ciudad de Bogotá en la revisión de su plan de ordenamiento territorial, que es una figura que ayuda a las ciudades, al gobierno de la ciudad, a definir qué áreas se van a desarrollar, con qué tipo de infraestructura, qué estrategias de protección se van a dar para los recursos naturales, cómo se van a organizar las actividades económicas, y en medio de esa reflexión nos encontramos con algo muy particular, y es que Bogotá, la ciudad de Bogotá, tiene una política de abastecimiento alimentario y tiene una política de política pública de ruralidad, es decir, una política pública que procura la protección de estos pobladores rurales, que son muy pocos, llegan a más o menos 50.000 habitantes, versus los 7 millones, casi 8 millones de habitantes que tiene la ciudad de Bogotá. Pero como les decía, estos habitantes campesinos ocupan el 75% de esas áreas rurales, con un fuerte vínculo a su estructura ecológica, a sus recursos naturales. Entonces yo llego por allí, llego aportando elementos a esa política pública, entendiendo esas periferias. Yo comencé a trabajar esto en barrios populares. Hay un trabajo que hice ya hace más de 20 años sobre el desplazamiento forzado, la migración forzada, producto de la guerra en Colombia, de personas del campo que llegan a la ciudad de Bogotá. Y en medio de esos recorridos me encontré con ese territorio, el territorio de los campesinos que habitan la ciudad. Entonces para mí fue una paradoja encontrar tan cerca la ciudad personas desarrollando actividades agrícolas y manteniendo sus condiciones de vida campesina. Comencé a hacer un trabajo etnográfico, comencé a caminar esa zona, a hacer muchas visitas a través de mis cursos, a tomar muchas fotografías, a levantar muchas historias de vida, y se me fue convirtiendo en un laboratorio de trabajo, esa zona en particular, el borde sur de la ciudad de Bogotá. Y a partir de allí comencé a sistematizar la experiencia, luego pues empiezo a hacer mis estudios de doctorado y lo tomo como un caso de estudio, pero allí el reto era no acercarme o utilizar más bien los datos cuantitativos, la georreferenciación, por supuesto, mirar los cambios en los usos del paisaje, las estadísticas, la demografía, pero cuando se mete uno a fondo a recorrer esto con los campesinos, con quienes habitan allí, el lenguaje y la metodología cambia por completo. Entonces tuvimos que comenzar a desarrollar muchos grupos focales, trabajando sobre temáticas, la temática alimentaria, la temática educativa, la temática productiva, económica, el papel que tienen las mujeres, el liderazgo femenino en esa zona es muy importante, el papel que tienen los recursos naturales, su valoración y su gestión, los servicios ambientales. Entonces comenzamos a hacer grupos focales trabajando sobre campos temáticos específicos. Y luego hicimos la traducción de esas reflexiones de las comunidades a través de la cartografía social, que se vuelve una herramienta también muy poderosa para traducir esos datos demográficos, esos datos, llamemos de georreferenciación dura, cambios de uso del paisaje y todos estos lenguajes, pero traduciéndolos a la luz de las narrativas de estos pobladores. Y allí es donde surge lo que yo llamé en mi trabajo un método etnográfico integrado, tratando de poner en diálogo la georreferenciación, la cartografía social y la narrativa. Y aparece una herramienta también muy interesante, y es el mapeo de actores sociales, o lo que podríamos denominar ahora el análisis de redes sociales, ¿no? Tratar de llevar eso a un esquema donde las personas se comienzan a relacionar con instituciones, con organizaciones, con otros líderes, y eso permitió la esquematización que luego se puede llevar a un análisis de redes sociales, pero les permite a las comunidades saber su historia, su relacionamiento con las instituciones públicas, pero que no son relacionamientos inmediatos, son relacionamientos que llevan un tiempo largo de negociación, de planificación, de acuerdos. Entonces el análisis de esas redes sociales, de esos esquemas de redes sociales, ayudó también a ofrecer un dato muy importante para leer esos territorios en función de sus interacciones, ¿no? Entre distintas escalas, ¿no? El gobierno de la ciudad, la organización comunitaria, los líderes juveniles y comenzar a establecer como unas, ¿sí?, redes, redes de interacción en distintas escalas. Esa fue otra de las herramientas que se utilizó para este trabajo y que ofrece también lo que se está presentando hoy como parte de la apuesta, la contribución que yo estoy haciendo al Land Portal.
Thank you so much, Manuel. I'll also turn now quickly to Diana and Auta. Maybe I'll start with you, Diana, because I know that you mentioned earlier the importance of photography in your story. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that very briefly, and just the use of images within your story and how that helped to illustrate your main messages.
Thank you, Stacey. Just to also contextualize your question is that for us, the intervention that we were working on was settlement-wide. It was a community-wide kind of engagement. It was one that targeted not only the household level, but also the community scale level. So it was quite intensive, also particularly because it was targeting a lot of informal settlements, the 6 that I've mentioned that were part of the land repossession plan. So in terms of our advocacy agenda and in terms of us trying to maximize the reach just to get this message across that this land repossession plan was actually happening, graphics was very key for us because we had to really do a lot of advocacy initiatives, do a lot of messaging, get people on board and say that this is the kind of implications the demolitions and the evictions would have. So we were using our photography and our aerial imagery as a very crucial resource in not only developing the data story, but also in our advocacy agenda. And just to emphasize on that point, photography was key because it communicated to a very large extent the implications of the eviction. And what we did is that because our intervention was first of all informed by a prior eviction that took place suddenly. And then this first eviction is what led to us knowing that there was a plan for eviction of 6 other areas. So we were able to use the photos from the first eviction to communicate the message that in the case that this plan takes shape, this is what we will be seeing. And you know, photographs are very powerful. You know, you can say that, okay, we'll have 70,000 people evicted, but if it doesn't have something to carry that image, then people will not pick up your message. So we had photography showing the gross violation of the first eviction and showing images of women and mothers and children with their luggages that they had that they could only get from the wreckages. I mean, it was just very emotional, even in terms of how we used this photography, but we just had to communicate a message. Another key graphic that we used was aerial imagery. As I've said, our intervention was really relying on this spatial technology because it was a very fast reaction to intervene in these planned demolitions. So through the aerial imagery, and we're able to highlight and demonstrate the number of structures that would be affected if the demolitions took place. So this aerial imagery was used to an extent that we were able to sort of draw around the informal settlements, the kind of extent the demolitions would have in terms of how many houses will be demolished, how many schools, how many churches, how many shops. So implications of the social aspects, the political aspects, the community resources. So that is what we were able to do using the aerial imagery and combining this kind of spatial technology with the photography and trying to maximize a lot of it in terms of how they complement each other was something that was very helpful in our advocacy strategy. It made our data story very impactful because it capitalized on this kind of two graphic resources. But of course, even in terms of messaging on social media, in community platforms, because I'd said also our initiative was a very community-led initiative. So also trying to see how can we reach as many community members as possible? How can we have the social movements and the grassroots movement participate in this kind of advocacy intervention? And it was through use of photography. So it was very easy to ensure the reach was there. For those who are not able to really access maybe the maps or the spatial technology, then the data story made it possible for them to actually see, oh, this is what it means in case this eviction takes place in these kinds of settlements. So I think in a nutshell, that was really how we were able to use photography, and not only use it alone, but also link it to spatial technology.
Thank you, Dawn. Yeah, thanks. You bring up a really good point about the use of images and not only conveying emotion, but showing the emotion that is occurring there. And I think that that's also important when relaying the message. So I'll ask the same question to Auta. Auta, if you can also, because you mentioned earlier also the importance of the use of images and photos in your story. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sim, então, nós no Revelar-se trabalhamos com fotografia e a gente tem se dedicado muito a, não só a algumas de nós, de fato, realizam trabalhos profissionais como fotógrafas, mas a gente, enquanto coletivo, a gente faz um trabalho de refletir sobre a nossa comunidade e mostrar a nossa comunidade para, né, cidade, né? A partir do nosso próprio olhar, né? Então, porque em geral as narrativas sobre populações periféricas, né, aqui no Brasil, são feitas de uma forma que nós somos apenas informantes, né? De pessoas de fora que descrevem a nossa realidade, falam sobre a nossa realidade a partir de um olhar que é muito externo, né? E às vezes muito exotizante, né? Parece que o lugar que a gente vive é um lugar exótico, diferente, né? Do que seria a referência. Então, no nosso caso, a gente tenta construir, no caso da nossa história, a gente usou as fotografias, né, assim como Diana também, para dar cara a esses dados, né, e para dar um rosto a esses dados, para dar vida a esses dados, e um rosto que foi desenhado por nós mesmos, né, que foi construído por nós mesmas. Então, o que a gente acha que é importante, né, na nossa história é que é uma autoria das próprias pessoas de quem se costuma falar, né? No caso do Revelar-se, nós somos um coletivo de 15 mulheres, né, moradoras aqui do COC, que realiza, né, várias atividades relacionadas com arte, com fotografia, mas que juntas a gente tenta construir, né, essa nossa referência sobre a realidade. Então, todos os apoios, né, seja a universidade, sejam as organizações, né, da sociedade civil, são muito bem-vindas, né, para nos apoiar no nosso trabalho, mas a gente também entende que nós temos condições de produzir, né, o nosso próprio trabalho. Então, sobre a nossa comunidade, então, produzir dados, produzir imagens, né, produzir informações sobre essa realidade que nós mesmas vivenciamos. Então, a gente entende que isso é algo muito importante e que precisa ser feito, né, cada vez mais pelas pessoas que ocupam os territórios periféricos, né? E aí, no Brasil, a gente tem tido um desafio muito grande para acessar dados oficiais. A gente tem aqui no Brasil o Instituto Brasileiro de Geografia e Estatística, que é o IBGE, que é o órgão, né, do governo responsável pela produção de dados que vão subsidiar a construção de políticas públicas para todas as áreas, né, que a população necessite, né, seja saúde, seja educação, seja moradia, por exemplo. E aí, como na nossa história a gente trouxe dados sobre violência, sobre educação, sobre moradia, né, a gente precisou de dados oficiais, e no caso do Brasil, o último censo, quer dizer, o último levantamento, né, de dados geral sobre a população brasileira foi realizado em 2010. Então, a gente tem dados que estão, na realidade, desatualizados. Muitos territórios, aqui em Pernambuco e em outros lugares também do Brasil, têm realizado um alto censo, quer dizer, a produção de dados, né, a construção de dados feitas pelos próprios moradores, né? No caso do COC, a gente não conseguiu fazer isso porque a gente não tem recursos, né, atualmente para realizar esse tipo de pesquisa, né, interna, mas a gente entende que isso é muito importante. Então, como a gente não conseguiu realizar ainda, né, o nosso autocenso, a gente buscou informações dos órgãos oficiais e das organizações e trouxe esses dados utilizando, né, mapas e fotografias para que as pessoas que tivessem acesso a esses dados pudessem entender como é que eles se dão, né, na realidade, na nossa vida, né, na nossa prática. Então, as imagens, né, as fotografias e os mapas, eles nos ajudaram, né, a ilustrar, a fazer com que as pessoas, né, que estão distantes, que não conhecem a nossa realidade, pudessem ter acesso a isso, né? Então, esse foi o nosso esforço, né? Essa foi a nossa tentativa, né? De utilizar as fotografias para dar vida.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alta. No, what I hear from you and Diana is that photography and images are a way to bring people closer to the reality that's occurring. So I think, thank you so much for sharing that, all three of you. We have many questions for you, and I see many questions in the Q&A box, and we also had more questions for you, but I'll turn it now to Conrad, and then maybe in the last, maybe 25 minutes, we can aggregate everyone's questions and make sure everyone gets in there. So Conrad, I'll turn it to you now, and maybe you can tell us just briefly a little bit more about how people can contribute to the data story section and how we can maybe help bring people's story to life, if you will. So leave it to you.
Yeah, thanks. So actually it was one of the questions in the Q&A section. So let's just pretend we are still answering questions from our wonderful audience. So the one attendee participant actually asked if there's a way or a possibility to actually contribute yourself to that data section I was just presenting before. And actually, one reason of this webinar here today is, of course, showing you the wonderful stories from all over the world and their authors, but also to welcome you to submit maybe your own ideas for story maps. And you can do that by simply contacting us via email on the land portal. And then you would give us an idea on the research, the advocacy you're doing in your country, your region, your village, whatever you work on. And we could conceptualize with you together how we could come up with a story map. And I think the concept of story maps has now been sufficiently shared by our participants, but I would still maybe quickly share my screen again to show you another storyline on map maze in Thailand and how land use change has actually changed in recent years. It's by one of our colleagues here in the land portal. And what I would like to show you is that here as well, just as the examples we had heard and or shown already, is that we have a mix of statistical data, which might be boring, but a very good narrative around it, showing you what actually happens. And now the idea of us would be that you would have maybe a story in mind and then some spatial data, some qualitative data, some pictures. And with that, we would develop something interactive together. So for this story map, for instance, we came up with provinces and their maize harvest, and then you have certain buttons you click on, and then you as a reader can understand the text better on how maize harvest and production has changed in Thailand. And also for people who are maybe not familiar with provinces in Thailand, you can actually click on the text, zoom to that province, and understand the data and the narrative behind better. So presumably you have some data ready and you would like to share it with a bigger audience. We can just welcome you to contact us. And then with you together, we would come up with something and we would then share the data story in our data section. But yeah, we would be featuring it, but you would be still the co-author, just as with the story maps you see in our data section. Yeah, I think that's it, Stacy.
Conrad, yeah, maybe we can start picking some. What do you think? Can we start picking some questions from the audience? I saw some interesting ones.
Yes.
I maybe I can go ahead. There was one that really stood out to me, and I think it because it also encapsulates a little bit some of the questions that we had wanted to ask the winners. And but you know we only have a limited amount of time. But the question was, and maybe I can ask Manuel first. One of our audience members is asking what was the most challenging aspect while developing the data story, and I'll add on a little bit to that. If you can tell us about the most challenging aspect and also a little bit about the process of working with us in the last few months, and hopefully that process wasn't challenging, but maybe we can mix those two questions and you can tell us a bit more about that. Maybe I can bring it to Manuel first.
Bueno, yo creo que el reto más complejo es llevar la idea que uno tiene en su cabeza, que puede ser una galaxia completa, a sintetizarla en un texto y una imagen, que diga y que uno sienta que dice lo que uno quiere expresar. Creo que ahí es donde está el mayor esfuerzo. Es una cuestión más intuitiva, más de percibir, de conocer el terreno y de poder tener la seguridad de quien elabora la historia, que lo que se está diciendo es lo que se quiere expresar. Creo que ahí es donde está el punto más clave. En esta revolución tecnológica en la que vivimos, de los medios de comunicación, de la simplificación, esto hace más gustoso, más rápido, más eficiente que la gente capture la idea con la imagen, el texto, el mapa, el esquema, los datos, de una manera más ágil y tome decisiones también muy rápido o comprenda más rápido el problema. Creo que ese es el reto más complejo. Ahora, el segundo reto es la técnica, el software, los pasos. Noté, por ejemplo, que no es un problema el idioma, por ejemplo, que se hable español, francés, portugués, inglés. No, ese no es el problema, se puede traducir, hay traductores. Y creo que el apoyo de Coran, de Stacy, de todo el equipo de Land Portal, pues es esencial para poder llevar esa idea a ese lenguaje que utilizan los software, ¿no? Que un poco la pregunta es, el gran reto hoy es cómo volver un dato, una narrativa, un hecho geográfico, un hecho localizado, o sea, cómo mapear eso, cómo espacializar eso. Y creo que la técnica y Land Portal se ubica justamente allí para ayudarnos a muchos, a líderes, investigadores, estudiosos de los temas en distintas partes del planeta, a ubicar eso en las plataformas del lenguaje virtual, ¿no? Y creo que todo este impulso de la inteligencia artificial, de todas estas cosas que están ocurriendo globalmente, que nos posibilitan estar, yo desde aquí, desde Colombia, Auta en Brasil, el resto, entiendo que hay gente de Francia, de África, pues nos da la posibilidad de entrar en ese mundo. Ahora, tenemos aquí hacer un poco más de conciencia de cómo hacemos eficiente esa relación tecnológica de las plataformas y las ideas, que son más individuales, más, llamémoslo, subjetivas. ¿Cómo fusionar eso? Creo que este es un gran laboratorio donde eso se está dando y donde recurrir a eso va a generar muchas apuestas y fortalezas para distintas personas, desde las políticas públicas, desde los líderes en las regiones, desde los investigadores, desde cualquier persona común y corriente que logre ingresar a la plataforma y pueda leer esas problemáticas, ayuda también a un aprendizaje más globalizado y mucho más consciente del valor que tiene la Tierra hoy, socialmente y ambientalmente para el planeta. Entonces creo que esos son los dos gran retos, la unión de las tecnologías y esas intuiciones, esas ideas y convertirlas en un lenguaje gráfico más eficiente, con más color, con más fuerza interpretativa. Ya está de cada cual, de cada persona, abstraerlo, ¿no? Y tomar decisiones. Creo que ahí es donde está el punto para poder traducir estos aportes a la acción, ¿no? A la intervención, a la transformación.
Thank you so much, Manuel. I think Conrad and I can also attest to the fact that it's sometimes difficult to take like a large amount of information and make it concise, because I think sometimes even the more tools you have to communicate something, you know, of course, the more interesting it is, but then the more complicated it can get to find the proper channel to communicate what you want to say. Thank you for sharing, Manuel. I'll ask Auta now the same question. You know, can you just share with us some of the challenging aspects of developing your data story? Just in very, very briefly in a few minutes. I'm not sure if Auta was able to hear my question. Sorry, Auta, it was just the same question that we posed to Manuel, which was basically if you could share some of the challenges of creating your story very briefly with the audience.
Sim, acho que o grande desafio, né? Primeiro foi um pouco esse que eu falei, né? De acessar dados atualizados. A gente não teve a realização do último censo da população aqui no Brasil. Isso está sendo organizado esse ano, era para ter acontecido em 2020, mas em função da pandemia e também da falta de vontade política em 2001, ele vai ser realizado agora. Então, acessar dados atualizados não foi fácil, a gente precisou buscar de outras organizações, né? Então, por exemplo, a Habitat para a Humanidade Brasil nos ajudou a acessar dados, né, sobre moradia, que para a gente são dados muito importantes, né, muito caros, porque como a nossa história é sobre o COC, né, que é a nossa comunidade, é uma comunidade que tem sofrido, né, com despejos nos últimos anos, e isso não é uma realidade apenas do COC, né, é uma realidade de muitas cidades no Brasil. Então, acessar dados sobre despejos, sobre moradia, é algo muito importante, e aí a gente precisou do apoio, né, do compromisso de organizações da sociedade civil para fazer isso. Então, esse foi o primeiro grande desafio, né, produzir essa história com esses dados. Mas para a gente, né, além das dificuldades, né, teve essa possibilidade de ilustrar esses dados, o que para nós, né, é algo muito importante, politicamente também. A Land Portal, né, nos ajudou com a tradução, né, pode parecer uma coisa simples, né, para quem trabalha, né, com isso, né, com diferentes regiões, né, para a gente a tradução é algo que não é muito fácil, né, de ser feito, a outros idiomas, né, aprender outros idiomas. Então isso para a gente foi muito importante, né, e a Land Portal também nos ajudou a qualificar, né, o texto, esses dados, né, e fazer com que eles se tornassem também acessíveis, né, para outras pessoas. Então, isso para a gente foi muito importante, né, além da possibilidade de conhecer outras histórias, né, além de contar a nossa história, né, para muitas pessoas, a gente também pode conhecer essas outras histórias, né, tanto de Manuel como da Diana, que estão aqui contando para a gente, né, mas acessar o portal, né, ver que tem outras comunidades, né, em torno, ao longo dos cidas com as nossas, né, nos faz pensar como de fato, o racismo, né, por exemplo, é um problema sistêmico, né, um problema que está no mundo inteiro que precisa ser combatido. Então, eu acho que esse foi um desafio, não só da nossa história, mas acho que é um desafio que a gente tem enquanto sociedade, né? Eu acho que as nossas histórias, né? E aí eu digo nossas do Revelar-se, né? Como as de vocês que estão aqui compartilhando com a gente, elas nos mostram, né? Apontam cada vez mais para esse desafio, né? De vencer para as pobres empobrecidas, né? Que o fato de compartilhar essas histórias nos faz pensar sobre isso, né? O quanto esses desafios estão presentes na nossa vida, mas não só na nossa vida, né? De tantas pessoas aí ao redor do mundo.
Thank you, Alta. I'll ask Diana the same question super briefly, Diana, if that's okay, because then we'll move to some, there's a lot of questions coming in, so yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Stacey. And I think I agree with Alta and Manuel in terms of some of the challenges that were coming up. It was really about how do we make this data speak? How do we make this data enhance the kind of advocacy approaches that we were doing, that kind of advocacy work, so that then there's that reach. And just in brief, in reference to also these kinds of challenges, just to mention that I think this engagement with the land portal has really helped in strengthening our thinking in terms of what can data do for you? What can data bring about in terms of change? And change, I mean in different skills, particularly for us, because we do a lot of engagement even at the policy level, using data and data stories to influence policy and practice. I mean, I think the engagement with the land portal has really enabled us to envision that kind of engagement or that kind of process. We have also been able to reimagine the power of storytelling. As simple as it sounds, you know, if local communities have the capacity or the understanding to easily express different stories about how they experience life, how they deal with challenges in their day-to-day lives, then it becomes very easy for them to participate in decision making or participate in different national conversations. So that kind of engagement in terms of also visibility, in terms of reach, and really just thinking about how to enhance access to different socioeconomic rights. I mean, this engagement with the land data portal has really enhanced these kinds of thinking around these different kinds of issues. And I think it's something that all present participants can really take up as something that can also enhance the work that they're doing at their scale and really rethink about the capacity and the power of data to really bring about any kind of change. So I think it's been quite good. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Diana. We've enjoyed working with all of you as well. So we're grateful for all the submissions that we received. Conrad, can I bring it to you now to maybe either pick a question, or I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add on to Diana's intervention?
Actually, I think everything important has been said, so I can't really add on that. I was just trying to answer the question again in a written format, how people can contribute. So at the landportal.org webpage, there's a section Get Involved, and here you can register, create, and also, or you just simply drop us an email. So I was a bit distracted at this point, I'm sorry, but
Yes.
I would like to maybe pick the question I already answered by typing into the answer box for the Q&A section. There was a person asking what simple tools we recommend to use to collect maybe spatial data or data then used to create story maps for the land portal. And there's a webpage someone else has mentioned as well, sorry, an app. Free and open source. It's called Odk Collect. And this map Odk Collect actually allows you to create your own self-designed survey in your smartphone. You could have free text answers, digital numbers, sliders, etc. for yourself. And you can also take pictures And through the GPS function of your smartphone, you have that georeference as well. So you can go around in your community, for instance, take pictures, they are georeferenced, and then make some notes to it or ask people certain questions. And those answers you will put into your smartphone will then be stored in a table and can be immediately used for further analysis. So that's quite a handy tool and doesn't necessarily require a real expertise, I would say. So that's pretty handy. Actually, this question was asked twice, as I can see. So I hope that maybe I have answered that in a or I have elaborated on that sufficiently. The other comments I have to say sorry are in French or other languages I'm not able to ad hoc translate.
Yes.
But there was one question which I found quite interesting, and maybe I can direct that to our panelists again. And that was the questions about different countries. So in some countries, the data on land management or ownership and also the sharing of data publicly reflects transparency. And now one of the audience members anonymously asked about the experience in different countries. And since we have 3 people from 3 different countries here with us, the question was, in your experience, what hinders the sharing of land data? Or as I have said, land data can be scarce. Can you, from your own experience, answer the question why in some countries data on land is not to an extent available as we would wish for? Diana, could you answer that maybe, or give your perspective?
Yeah. I think I could give my reflections on the question. Maybe, and I would be referring to the Kenyan context. Just to mention that generally, in terms of data, even census data that the government normally carries out after 10 years, we find that it's normally not very easily accessible. And sometimes it is accessible, but generally it's not very accessible. And even when it comes to that kind of access, you'd find that a lot of information on the informal population, the population that exists in informal settlements or that inhabit the informal settlements, you find it that it's always constantly not there. These kinds of gaps in data processes at the national level has really had a lot of civil society actors engage with the informal settlement communities. And it's because of this engagement that we find over time informal settlements are constantly now getting a voice where they were not having a voice at all. It has always been a gap that has been there. So even in terms of evictions, like the eviction that happened in Kariobangi that my story refers to, you'd find that you'd not find information before. How many people were in Kariobangi before the eviction? So such gaps were always avenues that were used to really take advantage of this informal populations. So generally it is a very big gap in terms of land data and land inventories, and also in terms of land uses and land inhabitants. Within the formal context, the formal tenure context, you may find it there, but within the informal context, it's always been a gap. And that's why even with the land portal interventions and the data stories, then it becomes very handy because then informal populations are able to claim visibility. They're able to show that they're actually there, that in these informal areas that there's this number of people and this is how their profile looks like. So it forms a big part of our advocacy processes in Kenya, because then that is something that we always used to say, even in terms of resource allocation in urban planning processes. How can the urban poor claim that space? And it's through data. So then I think for me, that is how I would respond to the question. But just accepting that for us, it's always a challenge. It's always a challenge accessing. But now communities are actively generating their own data. They're actively claiming their presence, their recognition using their own generated data. Yeah. Yes.
Thanks. And I can say from a production perspective, there's another problem with the accessibility or the amount of data available, because obviously tenure changes continuously and land use changes continuously. And so it's a lot of technical experience needed and money to produce this up-to-date data on tenure, land use, accessibility. I think, Manuel, you also wanted to say something, or you rose your hand by accident?
Sí. Yo creo que de las dificultades que hay para hacer posible que la información de procesos comunitarios localizados, de historias de vida que requieren ser reconocidas a nivel de otros contextos, otras entidades, otros lugares, lo digo un poco desde la experiencia mía como profesor universitario. Hace uno de estas investigaciones e inmediatamente la referencia es a publicarlas en revistas indexadas, con una suerte también de procesos de revisión que demoran mucho tiempo, y esas consultas a ese tipo de revistas no las puede hacer cualquier persona común. Un líder local no lo va a poder hacer porque no está en su lenguaje. Voy a poner un ejemplo. Si yo recuerdo que elaboré un artículo donde coloqué los resultados parciales de mi investigación. Ese artículo lo han leído a nivel global unas 15 personas. 15 personas lo han leído, sé que lo han leído. Yo estoy seguro que lo que acabamos de hacer, de las 120 personas que han estado conectadas en esta plataforma, yo creería que al menos de esas 120, 80 van a leer el material. Y ya con eso, nosotros, Diana, Auta, creemos que hemos ya tenido incidencia mucho más amplia. Entonces creo que ahí es donde está la gran apuesta de hacer que estos datos complejos, en muchos de ellos hay elementos de condiciones de marginalidad de los habitantes, incluso de violación de derechos, incluso de formas de violencia, necesitan ser expresados globalmente. Nos vamos a demorar mucho tiempo si lo hacemos por la otra ruta, por la ruta de las revistas indexadas, todo ese recorrido del lenguaje académico. No quiero decir que no sea importante, puede ser importante, pero creo que el escenario que se abre con LAM Portal nos da la posibilidad de llegar mucho más rápido, de una manera más directa, para generar esa transformación. Si no, nos demoraremos mucho más tiempo en que estos casos particulares de Auta, de Diana, puedan ser conocidos a nivel global y podamos interactuar y al menos ya tener la referencia de que existen personas trabajando estos temas. Creo que ahí es donde está la fuerza de territorializar estos datos, y allí es donde está la fuerza de LAM Portal.
Eu acho que essa pergunta é muito boa, ela precisaria de outro workshop para a gente responder, mas como a gente não tem tempo, eu vou tentar ser breve. Eu acho que uma coisa que nos ajuda a pensar é quem produz os dados e para quê, né? A partir de quais interesses. Vou tentar responder de uma forma geral, falando sobre o Brasil, e de uma forma específica, falando sobre a nossa comunidade. Então, no caso do Brasil, a gente tem passado recentemente por grandes problemas sobre transparência e a produção de dados e informações confiáveis. Como eu disse, né, a gente tem o IBGE, que é um instituto confiável, né, que já existe há muitos anos no Brasil, mas que teve um corte, né, muito grande de recursos, e isso impactou na produção de dados. O IBGE, se a gente produz dados para construir um diagnóstico da realidade, para a partir daí produzir políticas públicas, no caso do Brasil, a gente tem vivenciado esse grande problema, né, de uma ausência de vontade política, né, por parte do poder público. E aí isso se relaciona, né, com a questão da transparência de uma forma geral, e no caso da nossa comunidade, por exemplo, a gente não tem dados atualizados sobre a quantidade de moradores, né, acesso a porcentagem de pessoas que estão desempregadas, né, que estão abaixo da linha da pobreza. Então, a gente tem muita dificuldade de acessar dados atualizados, né, e isso tem um impacto na nossa capacidade de exigir e reivindicar políticas para dar conta, né, políticas públicas para dar conta dessas necessidades. E aí, no caso da nossa comunidade, existe uma produção de informações por parte da mídia hegemônica, que é muito desumanizante. A nossa comunidade, ela é muito associada, assim como outras comunidades, assim como outros bairros periféricos, né, de Recife e de outras cidades, a narrativa predominante é sempre da ausência, né, por um lado, e sempre da criminalização por outro lado, né? Existe um processo de criminalização da pobreza que é aprofundado pela narrativa, né, produzida. Então, essa questão da transparência é um grande problema que a gente tem vivenciado em Recife em particular, e a gente tentou, história, né, mostrar que esses dados, né, que precisam, né, melhor compromisso também por parte do poder público, precisam ser vistos, né, com mais cuidado, e precisam servir
Thank you so much, Odk, and thanks all of you for sharing. I think we've had a really rich discussion. We only have a few minutes left, and as Odk said, I think with some of the questions.
Vocês me escutam?
Okay. Yes, did she have a few words that she wanted to say, or?
Não, acho que é isso.
Perfect. Great. No, I think
é um desafio ainda, e que a gente tentou trazer alguns elementos na nossa história.
Yeah, it's just
great. Yeah, thank you for sharing. Odk was mentioning that I think with some of the questions coming in, we can really go off into completely different webinars and workshops. So there's really a lot to discuss. And I think we've had a really rich discussion thus far. I hope that we've been able to give you a little bit of insight into these 3 stories, although as Conrad has mentioned, there are many more stories in the data stories section on the land portal. And I hope that we've also encouraged you to do some work with us and share your ideas with us. So Conrad, do you have anything else to add before we completely wrap up?
Nothing from my side.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Thanks to the panelists as well for sharing their stories, and we look forward to being in touch. Bye, everyone.